Hello, and welcome to Reflections on Film. In this video, I'll be wrapping up my analysis of the Alejandro Iñárritu film, Birdman, or The Unexpected Virtue of Ignorance. In the last 4 videos, I've laid out a pretty thorough argument that the film's opening credits tell us a story. We've discussed all of the events that take place in the story, and how they're mirrored in the main film. Now, as I wrap this series up, I'll lay out my final thoughts on some of the more complex concepts that I was able to draw from my interpretation of the film. To get things started, I'd like to take a closer look at the title of the film, which is actually 2 separate titles. The shorter and more common title, Birdman, seems like a sort of generic name for a film, making reference to the name of a superhero that our main character, Regan Thompson, became famous for portraying on screen. However, I think there's more we can draw from this. It's pretty easy to see that the word Birdman is really a compound word, or a word that's made up of 2 other words put together. It's the union of bird and man. A bird is obviously an animal, and man is separated from the animal kingdom by his ability to acquire knowledge, overcome ignorance, and achieve self-awareness. Animals, on the other hand, lack self-awareness and rely on instinct for survival. We can therefore see the bird to be symbolic of ignorance and the lack of knowledge, while man is symbolic of knowledge and self-awareness. What's really interesting to me is that bird and man are both creatures that have ascended above the rest of the animal kingdom. Birds do this literally. Natural selection have given them the evolutionary advantage of flight, allowing them to soar above the rest of the animal kingdom. Man has ascended through the acquisition of knowledge. We're able to store and recall information from memory and use that information to manipulate the future unlike any other animal. We see that despite following different paths to achieve it, bird and man both act as a representation of ascended beings, one having achieved this through ignorance of self, and the other having achieved it through knowledge of self. The union of the words in the title can be seen as an expression of what's required for an individual to not just ascend, but to experience true transcendence, the ability to accept truth as both ignorance and knowledge. In the film, we see Regan achieve transcendence. He doesn't just perceive himself to be a transcendent being, but actually becomes one. We see this in the scene where Regan wakes up in the hospital after having shot himself on stage. In essence, we see him descend so far into ignorance that he attains total self-awareness. He's able to understand the fundamental nature of his own being and recognize that his animal and human desires are not separate but simply 2 sides of his true self. Ultimately, I interpreted the film to be a metaphor for the attainment of true Buddhahood, which is a state of being that requires the individual to accept that their perceptions of truth and self-awareness are actually delusions, that it's impossible to truly achieve self-awareness by seeking only knowledge because the self is an infinite entity. It has no borders or boundaries, and there are no limits to its ability to affect the world around it. Exploring and seeking knowledge alone cannot lead to transcendence, because the knowledge that a man might acquire is infinite. You can never know everything there is to know about yourself. By understanding only knowledge, an individual may be able to experience fleeting moments of enlightenment, what is referred to as nirvana, and in doing so, orient themselves in the best way to interact with the world around them. Most branches of Buddhist philosophy would call this type of person a bodhisattva, a sort of living enlightened individual. However, in order to truly transcend the human condition, an individual must accept both knowledge and ignorance. This requires the individual to understand that ignorance and knowledge are not opposites, but are really 2 sides of a single entity, and it's through the experience of time that ignorance is converted into knowledge. Ignorance can then be thought of as truth which has yet to be revealed in time, while knowledge can be thought of truth which has already been revealed in time. Attaining this sort of transcendence requires the individual to accept that their perception of self-awareness is really a delusion. In order to acquire knowledge, we've developed this delusion of self-awareness. Our perception of selfhood is really just the result of the human experience of time. We have memory, which allows us to access information from the past, while our abilities to empathize and visualize the future allow us to manipulate that future. The delusion of self-awareness is what lies between these two aspects of the human experience. Our perception of selfhood exists only in the present, and the present is a subjective creation of each individual mind. Now that sounds pretty pessimistic, like I'm saying that every individual's experience of life is a meaningless fantasy. But it's important to keep in mind that I'm talking about the perception of self as a delusion. So what I really mean is that one's perception of the self as being a true expression of one's complete being is a delusion. The self is in fact infinite. It isn't just made up of the thoughts and emotions that an individual experiences as they move through time, but it's actually the sum total of all possible thoughts and emotions an individual is capable of experiencing. One's perception of the self merely represents the aspects of one's true infinite self, which he or she has chosen to express in the present. However, we're not just idle passengers through time. We make choices and exert free will along the way. We're able to adjust our perception of the self through the expression of free will. Now, free will can be thought of as the ability to manipulate the flow of time and space. Things are happening around you, and you can choose to change those things as they're happening. There's no limit to the number of ways an individual can choose to change the world around them. So we can say that our free will is an infinite concept. Now, if we think of free will as this sort of infinite pool of potential choices, we can see the expression of free will to be a decision to enact one of those infinite choices in the present. Similarly, the self is an infinite concept, made up of the sum total of both an individual's ignorance and knowledge. Our perception of self can be thought of as a single expression of that infinite self. Now that we've broken all that stuff down, I think it's pretty clear how the second title of the film we're given relates to the meaning of the first. The unexpected virtue of ignorance is the human ability to attain transcendence by totally accepting the delusion of self. By totally accepting the perception of the self as the true nature of one's being, the true nature of the infinite self is revealed, and the individual is able to express their freedom of will absolutely. I think the final idea to take away from this analysis is that to be alive means to live in ignorance. Our experience of life is digital, recording specific moments of time into memory. However, life is not digital, it's analog. There's no space between the moments. In each of these moments, we reflect one instance of our true infinite self upon the living world. We enter into each of these moments in ignorance, without any certain knowledge of what will happen. As that moment occurs in the present, we learn by observing and reflecting on it. And as that moment passes into memory, we then accept our delusional perceptions of it as truth. This is the basic model for the experience of any living being. The only way to escape this cycle is by learning to express one's freedom of will absolutely in every moment of one's life. This is the only way to transcend ignorance and knowledge and to express one's true infinite self in the living world. So if you've made it this far, I have to say I really appreciate you giving me your time, especially anyone who watched all 5 parts of this series. That's all for this analysis. This has been Reflections on Film, and once again, thanks for watching.